Breaking news. Explosions reported in Doha after Israeli airstrikes hit suspected militant bases. The scenes are chaotic. Rising flames in the distance, ambulances racing through traffic, and terrified civilians clutching children as they run. Social media would erupt instantly. Videos, shaky live streams, and endless hashtags. #Doha attacked, #Israel-Qatar war, #Middle East crisis. Within minutes, panic spreads far beyond the Gulf. Stock exchanges from Tokyo to London react violently, oil futures climb, and investors search for safety. Governments issue emergency statements, calling for restraint, but preparing for worst-case scenarios. For citizens outside the region, it might feel like a distant event. But for those who understand global politics, it would be clear. An Israeli strike on Qatar is not an isolated battle. It is a spark with the power to ignite regional war, reshape alliances, and drag superpowers into the fire. In those first hours, confusion rules, fear spreads faster than facts, and the world suddenly realizes it is watching history shift in real time. The Middle East has always been a chessboard of rivalries, shifting alliances, and unresolved wars. Iraq, Syria, Yemen, the Iranian nuclear standoff, and the endless Israeli-Palestinian conflict, each has shown how fragile the region really is. Into this volatile mix enters Qatar, a tiny peninsula on the Gulf but with outsized importance. It is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, a key supplier to Europe and Asia, and a global financial heavyweight. It also plays a political role far greater than its size, often mediating conflicts, funding humanitarian aid, and supporting groups like Hamas that Israel considers hostile. If Israel were to strike Qatar, the consequences wouldn't stop at Doha. It would rattle the world economy, threaten global energy security, and force every major power, from Washington to Moscow, Beijing to Brussels, to take sides. In a region already fragile, this would be an earthquake with aftershocks touching every corner of the world. Why would Israel, already juggling threats from Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas, risk striking Qatar? The answer lies in geopolitics. For years, Israel has accused Qatar of financing Hamas in Gaza, funneling money that strengthens the very groups launching rockets across its borders. Beyond that, Qatar maintains close ties with Iran, Israel's fiercest regional enemy. From Israel's perspective, Qatar is not a neutral player, but a hidden enabler of its adversaries. Then there's the media angle. Qatar's Al Jazeera network has been one of the strongest critics of Israeli policies, shaping international opinion against Tel Aviv. For Israeli leadership under pressure at home, targeting Qatar could be framed as cutting off a dangerous lifeline to Hamas and Iran. But the danger is enormous. Such a strike wouldn't just hit Qatar, it would challenge the entire Gulf, risk retaliation from multiple fronts, and potentially transform a shadow conflict into an open regional war. In Israel's calculation, Qatar is a threat worth neutralizing, but the cost of doing so could be catastrophic. The relationship between Israel and Qatar has always been complicated, defined by cautious diplomacy, quiet hostility, and public disagreements. In the 1990s, there was a brief window when Qatar tried to open its doors to Israel. It allowed low-level trade offices in Doha, signaling a willingness to engage. But this experiment was short-lived. Every time the Israeli-Palestinian conflict escalated, the fragile bridge between the two states collapsed. The wars in Gaza, the repeated bombings, and the humanitarian crises drove a wedge so deep that normalization became impossible. Qatar, meanwhile, positioned itself as a supporter of the Palestinian cause. It provided billions of dollars in aid to Gaza, often stepping in to pay salaries, rebuild infrastructure, and keep the besieged territory alive. Israel saw this not as humanitarian generosity, but as indirect support for Hamas, the group it considers a terrorist organization. In Tel Aviv's eyes, every Qatari dollar flowing into Gaza was another rocket, another tunnel, another attack waiting to happen. Adding to this was Qatar's global media influence through Al Jazeera. The network relentlessly criticized Israel's policies, aired footage of civilian casualties, and amplified Palestinian voices. For Israel, this wasn't just journalism, it was a weapon shaping world opinion against it. Over decades, mistrust hardened. Qatar's growing closeness with Iran only deepened the suspicion. And so, while no war ever broke out between them, Israel and Qatar became locked in a cold conflict, a silent hostility that could one day explode into open confrontation. Wars rarely start without a spark. For Israel to strike Qatar, there would need to be a trigger so powerful that it overrode the risks. Imagine a scenario where Hamas launches a devastating rocket barrage into Tel Aviv, killing dozens. Israel traces the funding for this attack back to Qatari aid money funneled into Gaza. Suddenly, politicians in Tel Aviv have a justification. Qatar is no longer a distant financier, but a direct threat to Israeli security. Or consider another possibility. Intelligence agencies uncover evidence that Qatari territory was used to coordinate a cyber attack on Israel's defense systems. In a world where cyber warfare is as destructive as bombs, Israel might see this as an act of war. A third trigger could come from the diplomatic stage. Qatar aggressively condemns Israel at the United Nations, lobbying for sanctions and threatening to cut energy deals with nations supporting Tel Aviv. For Israeli leadership already under immense domestic pressure, this could be the breaking point. History shows us that nations often go to war not only over direct attacks, but over perception. If Israel perceives that Qatar's actions, whether financial, cyber, or political, cross a red line, then the strike becomes defensive in its own narrative. The problem is, such a move would not remain isolated. The Gulf would see it as an attack on regional sovereignty. Allies of Qatar would rush to its defense, and what begins as a single trigger could spiral into a full-scale regional war. If Israel were to strike Qatar, what would it look like? Israel's military is among the most advanced in the world, armed with precision-guided missiles, stealth aircraft, and one of the strongest cyber warfare divisions on the planet. The most likely scenario would begin with airstrikes. F-35 stealth jets could take off under the cover of night, flying across the Gulf to hit carefully selected targets. These might include alleged militant safe houses, intelligence centers, or even Qatari infrastructure accused of aiding hostile groups. Missile strikes launched from the sea or Israeli territory could accompany the assault, designed to overwhelm Qatar's air defenses. Cyber attacks might also be unleashed, paralyzing government networks, disrupting communications, and sowing chaos before the first bomb even lands. Israel's goal would be to deliver a sudden, overwhelming blow, crippling Qatar's ability to respond and sending a clear political message. But here lies the danger. Qatar is not a defenseless target. It hosts the massive U.S. Al Udeid airbase, home to thousands of American troops and advanced military assets. Any Israeli strike risks hitting or involving U.S. forces, pulling Washington into the conflict immediately. Moreover, Qatar's wealth allows it to purchase state-of-the-art defenses and retaliate indirectly through alliances. A military strike may seem tactical on paper, but in practice it would be opening a Pandora's box of uncontrollable consequences. Beyond the political games and military strategies, the first victims of any strike are always civilians. Imagine Doha, a city of more than 2 million people, waking to the sound of explosions. Families scramble to shelters, parents shield their children, and hospitals overflow within hours. Roads jam as panicked residents try to flee, while supermarkets are stripped bare as people rush to stockpile food and water. In the chaos, electricity grids might fail, communication lines could collapse, and basic services would grind to a halt. Thousands would be injured, many killed, and the psychological trauma would scar an entire generation. Qatar, known for its modern skyline and luxury, would suddenly face the same scenes of devastation witnessed in Gaza, Beirut, or Aleppo. The irony would be cruel. A nation that prided itself on wealth and stability reduced to rubble overnight. International aid organizations would rush to respond, but the blockade of airspace and ongoing strikes could make access nearly impossible. Images of injured children, destroyed homes, and crying families would dominate global media, fueling outrage against Israel and sympathy for Qatar. The humanitarian toll would not just be a tragedy, it would become a weapon in the propaganda war, shaping how the world perceives this conflict. In the end, while leaders argue about geopolitics, it is always ordinary people who pay the heaviest price.
The moment Israel launches a strike on Qatar, the first and loudest reactions will come from the region itself. The Middle East is already a fragile web of alliances, rivalries, and historical grudges. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt have had a complicated relationship with Qatar for years. At times, they cut diplomatic ties, accused it of supporting terrorism, and even imposed a blockade. But when an outside power, especially Israel, directly attacks a fellow Gulf nation, the dynamics change. For Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, silence would be impossible. Even if they disagree with Qatar's policies, they cannot afford to look weak in front of their own citizens. Public anger would force them to issue statements condemning the attack. Turkey, which has a military base in Qatar and considers Doha a close ally, could respond even more aggressively. Ankara might threaten to send reinforcements, escalate militarily, or use the crisis to rally its influence in the Muslim world. Iran, always eager to undermine Israel, would see this as an opportunity to deepen ties with Qatar and present itself as Doha's protector. Egypt, balancing its ties with both Israel and the Gulf, would tread cautiously, but could not openly support Israel without facing backlash at home. The Arab street, the voice of the people, would roar with outrage. Massive protests could erupt in Cairo, Amman, Istanbul, and even in Gulf cities. Social media would amplify this anger, demanding leaders take action. Israel's move would not be seen as a limited strike. It would be framed as an attack on the entire Arab and Muslim world. And in that climate, even nations that prefer quiet diplomacy would find themselves dragged into the storm. How would Qatar react in the hours and days after the strike? The first step would be survival, assessing the damage, rescuing civilians, and restoring order in the chaos. But Qatar is not a powerless victim. With one of the highest GDPs per capita in the world, immense wealth reserves, and international connections, Doha has multiple ways to respond. Militarily, Qatar's air force is small compared to Israel's, but it has invested heavily in advanced fighter jets and defense systems. It could attempt to retaliate against Israeli targets indirectly, either through cyber warfare or by supporting regional groups hostile to Israel. Politically, Qatar would immediately leverage its diplomatic clout. Doha hosts numerous international organizations and has close ties with Washington, London, and European capitals. Its first move would be to rally the global community, framing itself as the victim of an unprovoked act of aggression. Qatar's media powerhouse, Al Jazeera, would play a central role, broadcasting images of destruction, interviewing survivors, and shaping the narrative against Israel. Economically, Qatar could weaponize its greatest strength: energy. As the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, it could threaten to cut or redirect supplies, throwing Europe and Asia into panic. Such a move would come at a cost but could force global powers to intervene diplomatically in its favor. Most importantly, Qatar would use its role as a mediator to turn the crisis into a rallying point, gaining sympathy from Arab nations and support from powers like Turkey and Iran. In short, Qatar may appear small, but its ability to hit back, through politics, media, and economics, would make Israel's gamble far more dangerous than expected. No analysis of Israel and Qatar can ignore the Palestinian question. For decades, Qatar has been one of the most vocal supporters of the Palestinian cause. It has poured billions into Gaza, funding electricity, salaries for civil servants, reconstruction projects, and humanitarian aid. From Israel's perspective, this aid indirectly strengthens Hamas, the very group launching rockets across its borders. Every time Hamas rebuilds after a conflict, Israel suspects Qatari money is behind it. But for Palestinians, Qatar has been a lifeline. While many Arab states have normalized relations with Israel in recent years, Doha has refused to abandon Gaza. It positions itself as both a humanitarian actor and a political supporter, keeping the Palestinian struggle alive on the international stage. That is why any Israeli strike on Qatar would not be viewed in isolation. It would be seen as an attack on one of the few states still standing firmly behind Palestinians. In Gaza, such a strike would spark outrage and likely fuel another wave of violence. Hamas would feel compelled to retaliate harder, not just against Israel, but possibly against Gulf states that fail to support Qatar. In the West Bank and Jerusalem, protests could erupt, intensifying already fragile tensions. Across the Arab and Muslim world, the narrative would be clear. Israel did not just bomb Qatar, it bombed the heart of Palestinian support. That framing would inflame passions, mobilize movements, and possibly trigger a new intifada. The Palestinian factor transforms this conflict from a bilateral crisis into a symbolic war over justice, identity, and survival. Perhaps the most critical response would come from Washington. The United States is not just an ally of Israel, it is also deeply tied to Qatar. The Al Udeid Air Base in Doha is America's largest military installation in the Middle East, housing thousands of troops and serving as a command center for operations across the region. If Israeli missiles struck anywhere near this base, the risk of American casualties would be real, and that would force the White House into a dilemma. On one hand, the U.S. has always stood firmly behind Israel, providing billions in military aid and political cover at the United Nations. On the other, Qatar is a strategic partner, supplying crucial energy to Europe and hosting American forces vital for stability. Choosing between them would be nearly impossible. The immediate reaction would likely be a call for restraint, an emergency summit, and behind-the-scenes pressure on Israel to halt further strikes. Publicly, Washington might avoid outright condemnation, but privately, anger would be undeniable. Domestically, the American public would be divided. Some would demand unwavering support for Israel, while others, especially given America's reliance on Qatari energy and bases, would call for neutrality. U.S. allies in Europe, desperate for Qatari LNG, would pressure Washington to lean toward Doha. Meanwhile, adversaries like Russia and China would exploit the split, portraying America as weak and divided. Ultimately, the U.S. reaction could decide the trajectory of the conflict. If Washington fully backs Israel, the crisis escalates into a regional war. If it pressures Israel to back down, it risks alienating its closest ally. Either way, the American response would be the most decisive factor in determining whether this is a short-lived flare-up or the beginning of a wider Middle Eastern war. The European Union would find itself trapped in a dilemma unlike any it has faced in recent years. On one hand, Europe has always maintained close ties with Israel, both politically and economically, especially in fields like technology, defense, and intelligence cooperation. On the other hand, Qatar is Europe's lifeline when it comes to energy. Since the Ukraine war, Europe has reduced its dependence on Russian gas, and Qatari liquefied natural gas shipments have become critical for keeping the continent's industries and households running. An Israeli strike on Qatar would therefore hit Europe at its most vulnerable spot. Brussels would immediately issue statements condemning the violence and calling for restraint. But behind closed doors, European leaders would panic. If Qatar were to retaliate by reducing LNG exports or redirecting them toward Asia, countries like Germany, France, and Italy would suffer an energy shock that could cripple their economies. Public opinion across Europe would also pressure governments to support Qatar, as images of civilian suffering flood media outlets and protests erupt on European streets. Yet standing firmly with Qatar would risk straining relations with Israel and by extension Washington. France, with its history of involvement in the Middle East, might take a more assertive stance, possibly pushing for a UN resolution condemning Israel's actions. Germany, balancing its historical responsibility toward Israel with its economic dependence on Qatari gas, would struggle the most. Eastern European states, more aligned with U.S. foreign policy, could side with Israel. This internal division would paralyze the EU's ability to act decisively. In the end, the European Union's dilemma would not just be about choosing sides, it would be about survival. Without Qatari energy, Europe faces blackouts, inflation, and unrest. Without Israeli cooperation, it risks alienating its transatlantic partner. The EU would desperately push for negotiations, But the crisis would expose its deepest weakness: dependence on others for both energy security and geopolitical stability. Energy has always been the beating heart of global politics, and in this crisis, it becomes the ultimate weapon. Qatar is not just another Gulf state, it is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. Its tankers sail across oceans, fueling power plants in Europe, factories in Asia, and homes around the globe. The moment Israel strikes Qatar, markets would erupt into chaos. Oil prices would skyrocket, natural gas futures would hit record highs, and stock markets would tumble under the weight of uncertainty. For Europe, still reeling from the energy fallout of the Ukraine conflict, this would be a nightmare scenario. Governments would face pressure to ration electricity, industries would cut production, and ordinary citizens would see their energy bills double or triple overnight. In Asia, giants like China, Japan, and South Korea, heavily reliant on Qatari LNG, would scramble to secure alternative supplies, bidding up prices in a frantic race that leaves poorer countries unable to compete. The ripple effect would reach every corner of the world. Airlines would raise ticket prices as jet fuel costs surge. Food prices would climb because transportation and fertilizer production depend on energy. Inflation, already haunting economies, would return with a vengeance. Central banks would be forced into difficult decisions: raise interest rates to fight inflation or keep them low to avoid recession. Meanwhile, Qatar would use its control of LNG as leverage. It could threaten to cut exports to nations that refuse to condemn Israel or reward allies with preferential deals. This weaponization of energy would transform the conflict from a regional clash into a global economic crisis. And as history has shown, from the oil shocks of the 1970s to the gas crises of the 2000s, when energy becomes unstable, the world itself becomes unstable. In modern conflicts, bombs and missiles are only half the battle. The other half is fought on screens, in headlines, and across social media platforms. Israel's strike on Qatar would ignite a media war on an unprecedented scale. At the center of this storm would be Al Jazeera, Qatar's global news network. For years, it has been accused by Israel and some Arab rivals of promoting anti-Israeli narratives. Now, with Qatar under direct attack, Al Jazeera would go into overdrive, broadcasting live coverage, humanizing victims, and portraying Israel as an aggressor targeting civilians. Israel, on the other hand, would deploy its sophisticated PR machinery. Its officials would appear on Western channels like CNN, BBC, and Fox News, framing the strike as a necessary preemptive action against a state that funds terrorism. Carefully chosen language like defensive strike and neutralizing threats would dominate their messaging. Israeli diplomats would lobby journalists, influencers, and policymakers to control the narrative. But in the age of smartphones, the real battlefield would be social media. Hashtags calling for boycotts of Israel would trend across Twitter and TikTok. Graphic images and videos, whether real or manipulated, would spread rapidly, fueling outrage and polarization. Cyber armies aligned with both sides would flood platforms with propaganda, while independent activists and hackers might leak sensitive documents or launch cyber attacks to influence public opinion. The information war would not only shape how the world perceives the conflict, but also influence real political decisions. Leaders cannot ignore public opinion when millions march in the streets demanding action. Narratives built in the media would pressure governments, corporations, and even international organizations. In this war of images and words, victory would not belong to the side with the most weapons, but to the side that controls the story. Whenever a crisis shakes the world, eyes inevitably turn to the United Nations. But in this case, the UN would be caught in its most familiar trap: power versus paralysis. The moment Israel strikes Qatar, the issue would be rushed to the Security Council. Arab states would demand an emergency resolution condemning Israel, calling for sanctions, and urging an immediate ceasefire. But as always, politics would get in the way. The United States, wielding its veto power, would likely block any resolution too harsh on Israel. Britain might follow suit, while Russia and China would seize the opportunity to side with Qatar and embarrass Washington. The result? Deadlock. Statements of deep concern and calls for restraint would flood out of UN headquarters in New York, but concrete action would remain elusive. This impotence would further damage the UN's credibility, already under fire for its inability to stop wars in Ukraine, Syria, and Yemen. Smaller states, especially in the global south, would voice their frustration, accusing the UN of being a tool of powerful nations. Yet the UN would not be entirely irrelevant. Its humanitarian agencies, UNHCR, UNICEF, and WFP, would mobilize to provide aid to affected civilians in Qatar. The General Assembly might pass a symbolic resolution condemning Israel, supported by an overwhelming majority of member states. While not legally binding, such a resolution would highlight Israel's growing isolation and increase pressure on countries allied with it. Still, the overall picture would be one of failure. Once again, the world's primary institution for peace would prove unable to prevent or stop a major conflict. The UN's role would be reduced to damage control, not decision-making. And in the eyes of millions, this would serve as yet another reminder that in the 21st century, international law bends to the will of power, not justice. Whenever a crisis erupts in the Middle East, global powers like Russia and China watch carefully, not just to react, but to seize opportunity. An Israeli strike on Qatar would provide both Moscow and Beijing with a golden chance to challenge U.S. dominance in the region. Russia, already active in Syria and aligned with Iran, would frame the attack as another example of Western-backed aggression. Russian diplomats would immediately call for restraint at the UN, painting Moscow as the voice of peace while secretly offering military or intelligence support to Doha. At the same time, the Kremlin would exploit Europe's panic over energy by promising increased gas supplies, deepening its leverage over the EU. China's strategy would be more subtle but equally powerful. Beijing has long invested in Qatar's energy sector and views the Gulf as a vital link in its Belt and Road Initiative. If Qatar feels betrayed by Western inaction, China could step in as its diplomatic and economic shield. By offering trade guarantees, technology partnerships, and even mediation, Beijing would strengthen its role as an alternative global power. For years, China has tried to position itself as a neutral peacemaker in the Middle East. This crisis would accelerate that image. Both powers would also use propaganda to weaken the U.S. narrative. Russian and Chinese state media would highlight civilian suffering, Western hypocrisy, and Washington's inability to control its ally Israel. This information war would not just sway opinion in the Middle East, but across Africa, Latin America, and Asia, regions already skeptical of U.S. policies. In short, the crisis would become a geopolitical chessboard. For Russia and China, Israel's strike on Qatar is not just another war. It's an opening to erode Western credibility and expand their influence in the world's most strategic energy hub. Every conflict begins with a strike, but history shows us it rarely ends there. Once Israel attacks Qatar, the danger of escalation into a full-scale war becomes almost inevitable. The Middle East is a region where alliances overlap and rivalries run deep. Qatar has security ties with Turkey, economic connections with Iran, and diplomatic links with powerful blocs like the EU and the US. Even if Doha itself doesn't launch direct military retaliation, its allies, or groups aligned with them, might. Imagine Hezbollah in Lebanon or militias in Iraq, already hostile to Israel, deciding to open new fronts in solidarity with Qatar. Hamas in Gaza could intensify rocket fire, dragging Israel into yet another bloody round of conflict. Iran might use the crisis as a pretext to flex its muscle, threatening the Strait of Hormuz, through which 1/3 of the world's oil passes. Suddenly, a localized strike spirals into a regional war. The danger doesn't end there. If Turkish troops stationed in Qatar are targeted, Ankara would be forced to respond, potentially bringing NATO into the equation. A clash between Israeli and Turkish forces could ignite a global standoff, with Western powers pulled in on one side and Russia or China maneuvering on the other. Airspace across the Gulf could turn into a battlefield, shipping lanes into choke points, and civilian populations into collateral damage. Wars have their own momentum. Once blood is shed, national pride, political pressure, and religious identity fuel the fire. Leaders who might prefer negotiation find themselves trapped by public outrage. The biggest risk here is not just escalation, it is miscalculation. One wrong missile, one accidental strike on U.S. troops, or one oil tanker sunk could push the crisis from a regional confrontation into a war with global consequences. While energy dominates the headlines, the economic fallout of such a crisis would spread far beyond oil and gas. Qatar is one of the richest countries in the world, with massive sovereign wealth funds that have invested billions in Western banks, real estate, and companies. A war that destabilizes Doha could shake financial markets from London to New York. If Qatar is forced to liquidate assets to fund defense or faces sanctions, stock prices of major corporations could tumble. The aviation sector would also be hit hard. Qatar Airways, one of the world's leading airlines, uses Doha as a global hub. If airspace becomes unsafe due to Israeli strikes, flights would be grounded or rerouted, straining international travel networks. Insurance costs for airlines and shipping companies would skyrocket, pushing up prices for goods and services worldwide. Tourism and sporting industries would not be spared either. Qatar recently hosted the FIFA World Cup, showcasing its ambition to be a global destination. An Israeli strike would reverse that image overnight, scaring away investors and damaging the country's long-term reputation as a safe haven for international events. Global trade would feel the tremors as well. The Gulf is home to some of the busiest shipping routes in the world. If tankers carrying not just oil but also food and consumer goods are delayed or attacked, supply chains already strained by past crises would collapse. Inflation would rise globally, currencies in emerging markets would weaken, and unemployment could spike as businesses struggle to cope. In short, the crisis would not just be about politics or energy, it would be an economic earthquake. The shockwaves would hit everyone, from factory workers in Asia to homeowners in Europe to small businesses in America. This interconnectedness means no country could stand by and watch. The global economy itself would be on the line. When the dust settles, one reality becomes clear. An Israeli strike on Qatar would mark the beginning of a new Middle East crisis, one that reshapes alliances, economies, and global power balances. Unlike previous conflicts confined to borders, this one would spread through energy markets, media narratives, and international institutions. It would no longer be just about Israel and Qatar. It would be about the world order itself. The crisis would highlight the fragility of Middle Eastern politics. Small states like Qatar, once considered untouchable due to wealth and diplomacy, would be shown as vulnerable. Israel, by acting unilaterally, would reinforce its reputation as a state willing to defy international norms for its security, but at the cost of deeper isolation. The Arab world, divided for years, might suddenly rediscover unity and anger, while powers like Turkey and Iran would seize the moment to expand influence. For global powers, the strike would be a test of credibility. The US would struggle to balance loyalty to Israel with its reliance on Qatar. Europe would confront the price of its energy dependence. Russia and China would exploit every crack in Western unity to push their agendas. And the UN, once again, would prove too weak to stop the bloodshed. The long-term consequences could be even more profound. Energy markets would never return to normal. Public opinion in the Muslim world would harden against the West, and extremist groups would exploit the chaos to recruit and expand. In many ways, this single strike could trigger a chain reaction leading to a decade of instability, much like the Iraq invasion did in 2003 or the Arab Spring in 2011. In the end, the question would not be whether Israel was justified or whether Qatar deserved sympathy. The real question would be, can the world afford another Middle Eastern war? And if history is any guide, the answer is chillingly clear. Wars in this region never stay local, they become global crises. And this one could be the most dangerous of them all.